Hey, everybody, welcome back to the ProgCast. I am your tireless host, Gregg Bendian, searching out all the most interesting creative musicians on the planet, as always. And today, of course, no exception because I am joined by a fascinating musician, Joel Harrison. He's a guitarist, but he's a composer and he's an author, and he has a very interesting new book called Pity the Genius, and it is about guitar players really through history and what their meaning is. And I know that Joel has had some help with fellow guitarists in putting this tome together. And I'm so happy to welcome to the podcast Joel Harrison. Hi, Joel.
Thanks, Greg.
So Joel and I had a lot of fun last month where Joel pitched in and joined the Mahavishnu Project for the very first performance of the complete Love, Devotion, Surrender album. That's right, the very first, because in the day when there was a Love, Devotion, Surrender tour, most of that record was not played all the way through live. It was piece here, piece there, and then there was some Billy Cobham stuff. So it's kind of special that we got to do this with my son Elias on second drum set and with Angel Lau on percussion and Joel and Robbie Mangano on guitars. Of course, Neil Alexander sticking strictly to B3 with Leslie in tribute to Larry Young. And of course, Brian Mooney on bass, the foundation. Hey, Joel, I definitely want to talk to you about this book, but since everybody's kind of really interested in this Love, Devotion, Surrender project, I guess, if you could talk a little bit about what that was like for you to step in. And I know you also have collaborations with other guitarists coming up very soon. So
I love playing with another guitar player, first of all. And so the idea of doing this music definitely appealed to me. I got to admit, when it came out, I did not really listen to this record. And I can't tell you exactly why. It just kind of wasn't on my radar screen for whatever reason. Although I was a huge John McLaughlin fan. So
Santana?
I was never the hugest Santana fan. I loved what he did at Woodstock, and I always thought he was great, but I just didn't listen to him. So I thought this record was, when I rediscovered it, was really interesting because it certainly shows Santana stretching out way more than he ever has in any other setting, if I'm not mistaken, like no comparison. And McLaughlin, really being himself, but also it does sound like a collaboration. This is simpler music than he would typically do, and very anthemic, very kind of groove oriented. And it was an example, I think, of music that's more fun to play than listen to. Like I don't love listening to those records that sometimes the solos, there's just so much guitar soloing that on a record, sometimes that can be a little much, but live, I bet that band was incredible to see up front. So to play it was exciting. And I thought part of what worked about it was you had a great set that you put together. It really parceled out drama in a good way, which is tricky. So it wasn't just all endless guitar solos, thank God. There was a lot of great drumming features, keyboard features. There was some quiet moments. And so I think it was a great thing for a guitar player to be on.
Yeah, I'm so glad. One of the things that I try to imbue the Mahavishnu Project with is that we do have a sense of freedom and being ourselves in the music.
Yes.
And so, I didn't hire you to come in and be Santana. I
Right.
hired you to come in and play this material the
Yeah.
way you would play it as Joel Harrison would play it. That's all we're ever interested in.
Right.
Of course, Robbie Mangano is not a John McLaughlin clone, and he's
Yes.
got full reign over whatever he wants to play. And I love guitar so much that it is really fun for me to have two guitarists. I did that briefly in Interzone. I had Nels Cline and Dave Fuzinski on a double
I never
guitar
heard
thing.
that.
Oh, it's in my archive. It's some live gigs that we did. But yeah, I mean, and also the Burton groups with
Yes.
Metheny and Goodrick. So yeah, hearing you play with another guitar player and knowing that you guys are so musical and tasteful that you weren't going to get in each other's way, but really did complement each other beautifully.
Yeah. Well, two guitar bands is one of my favorite things. Having grown up with the Allman Brothers and Grateful Dead, that was kind of a very powerful moment in music. And but in jazz groups, I love it too. Like I always enjoyed the collaborations um, that Bill Frisell did with other guitarists, and I love the group Bass Desires. I really like the sound of those records, and I love the Gary Burton groups. Um, I'm trying to think what else. I always loved Paul Motion's bebop band where there was two or three guitarists. Um, I mean, sometimes that would got a little much, like two bass players, and that was kind of crazy. But the two guitar thing, I love guitar duos with no rhythm section too. I love the John Abercrombie, John Schofield duos, the Ralph Towner, John Abercrombie duos. Oh my God, the Jim Hall, Pat Metheny record is incredible. Uh, and I remember even back when I was a kid seeing Herb Ellis and Joe Pass, or Barney Kessel and Herb Ellis, which was almost like feels medieval at this point. It's so far back, but it was the guitar is like a little mini orchestra, and so much can happen. It's infinite, and one player, almost with two players, it's 10 people instead of two. And my first record, let's not forget, is three guitarists and three drummers.
Right.
I came out of the gate with that, which still kind of shocks me.
Well, I'm curious, what were you noticing groups like Primetime having double of everything and Shannon Jackson having double of everything and the Coding Society and bands that were doing that Crimson's double
Oh
trio.
yeah, well, that was very formative at that age. Yes, for sure. Though that was really interesting. The King Crimson stuff. I don't even think I remember the Decoding Society had two guitars, but uh I don't know. The 3 + 3 = 7 record was sort of an anomaly that happened for its own set of reasons. I mean, three guitars, it's kind of crazy, and three drummers, but it's just always appealed to me, and it still does. My favorite record of Julian Lodge's is the one where Bill Frisell plays. And it's not that I don't like Julian's trio records. They're great, but it just sounds so beautiful. And so many of the pop people that we like have two guitars. Bonnie Raitt has always got two guitars on it. Steely Dan, often there's two guitars, and they have their parts. Funk groups, James Brown's group, it just works.
Well, it's so capable in so many ways. Register wise, you're covering a lot of ground. Texture wise, you cover a lot of ground. You can play really legato, you can play really staccato, you can play washy. So, I'm fascinated by this idea of the guitar as orchestra. Always have been,
Hmm.
uh, particularly when you heard guys like Holdsworth with his chord clouds. You're going, oh well, this guy's obviously thinking about an orchestra,
Yes.
right? And you cover some really interesting history of Holdsworth in your book. And
There's
they're
a guy who you'd never see with another guitar player, though. It would just be absurd.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
It's there's the
Who
one
would get on
record.
stage with him?
Well, there's the one Gambali, right?
I didn't know about that. I
Truth
mean,
and Shredding.
oh my God. I haven't
So
heard that. That sounds
I'm
scary.
not saying rush to hear it, but it's you are right. In fact, John McLaughlin told me once when we spoke about Alan that he had hired Alan to do a record with him, and Alan on the day of the recording he canceled.
Oh, well,
So you
that
know,
would have been pretty incredible.
John was trying,
Wow.
and then of course there's the other funny thing, which is Van Halen thinking that he was going to play with Holdsworth on road games. And Holdsworth is like, no.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, also the so-called last John McLaughlin tour with Jimmy Herring, I thought worked fantastic. I was surprised when I read about it, but it really worked great, I thought.
Well, Jimmy and is amazing, and his bandmates are amazing, and so you've got like basically the first and second generation right there, really kind of beholden to this music.
Mm.
Joel, this book where you cover, I think it's something like 33 different guitar players.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about the ones that you think are the most fascinating, or if you would just, pick a few and talk about stuff and tell people what they really should be checking out in guitar world that maybe they weren't aware of.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say there's some necessarily that I find more fascinating than others. They're all fascinating in different ways. Some, of course, would appeal more to what I do than others, but that was never the point. I would say what's interesting to me is the people that I didn't know much about who were so incredible, who affected the world either regionally in an important way or, sort of affected people after the fact, even after they were dead. I always like knowing about the people who are under the radar and are the underdog. And, we often in the world that we live in talk about the same people over and over and over again. For instance, I don't need to go see this new Dylan uh, movie about his time in the Village in 63, 64. We've heard this story almost as much as we've heard the story of Jesus in the Bible. It's like, do we really need to know more about Bob Dylan? He doesn't care what we think. So it's just a way to make money and burnish this time in history, even further. However, there's as Vernon Reid said, and I don't completely agree with this in the case of Jimi Hendrix, but in general, I agree with him. He said, there were a lot of people around at the time of Jimi Hendrix who could play this unbelievable stuff, but we don't know about them and we never will. There's always one person who pops out, and there's others that are really incredible that we'll never hear of. And so all of us, and you, I'm sure included, are interested in those underdogs. So a guy I'd never heard of was Snoozer Quinn, who in the 20s and 30s was a mythic guitar player. The the story in the book, and of course a lot of this is second and third hand, is that he could carry on a conversation with you and play with one hand and just be doing this amazing stuff. He was in Paul Whiteman's group, but he was really too good to be in the group. He could do so much that he was kind of relegated to a background role and then asked to. There was this job back then, apparently, that I never knew about, that in between sets of a performance at a nightclub, you'd have a stroller guitar player who'd go around and entertain people at their tables. And he could do anything. We think of now, who can do anything on the guitar? It's just somebody who's got this amazing technique. And we think about it, back then. And for Paul Whiteman, he would have been overqualified, but he affected so many people, but was never really recorded, and was an alcoholic and had a deformity of the head at birth, a cranial deformity, and a very shy and retiring person who didn't like being in Paul Whiteman's band and wanted to just go home and play regionally, which he did. And Danny Gatton is another person who I knew and saw dozens of times, who was also a really interesting figure. In his lifetime, Danny Gatton was not well known.
I know.
He started to get well known when he got his recording deal with, oh gosh, what was it? Epic. I can't remember the name of the label offhand. And but I knew the people in his band pretty well, and they talked about the fact that when they finally got the bus and the tour and all that, he was kind of, oh man, I don't know, I just want to be home with my family. If this had happened 20 years ago, it would have been great. And was happy to just kind of, well, sort of happy, intermittently happy, just to play regionally, but was really discovered on YouTube. Now he's world famous and talked about as one of the great guitar players of all time, which he is. But when he was alive, he was making $150, $200 going out and playing bars. And he was, to the day he died, practically, he was playing a brunch at Tyson's Corner every Sunday. Now, that's not something that Allan Holdsworth did. And they were equal in terms of their ability to play stuff that no human being to this day can play. I mean, I wouldn't put them in this. They're totally different. Like Danny was not a composer and not really a visionary in terms of music. But as far as just playing the guitar, this was truly one of the two or three greatest technical guitar players that ever existed. And this was his life, a brunch at Tyson's Corner, which is a shopping mall, by the way, outside of Washington, D.C., where people are more eating and listening. So when I say pity the genius, these people didn't lead easy lives. Snoozer Quinn was not happy. He was an alcoholic who died in his 30s from drinking. And we all know Holdsworth had a terrible problem with alcohol and was just terribly unhappy with his own playing. Well, and a wonderful human being, as far as I could tell. Gentle, beautiful spirit, the little I know and have heard. But inside himself, yow, man, what demons. And Danny, too. I mean, this is a guy who killed himself. So I think we need to be very aware of what it takes to be a prophet on your instrument and what it does to you or can do to you. And as I say in the book, these people in the olden days would have been called shamans or prophets. And they would have been treated like that. And they would have, I don't know, maybe had a relationship with deities that we no longer consider as real, that they would have thought might be shielding them from harm. Who knows? Village life is very different than modern life. But, be careful what you wish for if you want to be that good.
I had the pleasure of speaking to Gary Husband on this program about his work and his work with Allan Holdsworth.
Oh, I got to see that. I'd love to see that.
Well, it's intense because, it really comes to the point where I was curious, like, do you think Allan Holdsworth suffered for his work? And Gary's quick response was, I think he had to. So there's this, you're onto a very interesting area of this pity the genius concept, which is just say the exceptional don't always get caught doing what they're doing, and it's really sad and it's a strange fact of life that, for instance, talking to Herbie Hancock, he mentioned a drummer from Chicago that nobody knew that was like Tony Williams level, named Ike Day. And
Hmm.
I'd never heard of Ike Day. I don't know if there's any recordings of Ike Day, but this concept is a concept. Or even Alan Dawson being less known than Tony Williams, So
Hmm.
this is something where the fleas come with the dog. It's like if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. I don't know. I'm not going to try to do a third one of those, but
Yeah.
but you're right. It's so interesting because the suffering is, what is it, chicken and the egg? It's like the suffering can cause extreme creativity, but it can also extinguish creativity because there's just so much required to get going when you're a depressive person.
But I think there's something else to this, and this is something that, when as neurology and neuroscience becomes more sophisticated, maybe we'll learn more about. But I think that, from what I can tell, and I'm making vast generalizations here, but people who become that accomplished have an obsessive quality to them. They have to. And they're also born with something that the rest of us don't have. I'm sorry, the idea that everything is parceled out equally at birth and the guy that works the hardest is going to get the farthest is ridiculous. So I say in the book, God, I think I'm referring, I forget who I'm referring to, but I basically say I could practice 6 hours a day for 30 years and never make it uh, close to this person, whether it was Holdworth or whether, who might have played for 2 hours a day. So you're born with something, but you're also born with a way that your brain works that brings other things with it. And Danny was perhaps a little manic depressive, or certain people, I think, who are extremely obsessive have a certain, perhaps, autism spectrum thing going on. And um, I don't want it to sound like the old cliche that you have to suffer to be great and all geniuses are madmen or any ridiculous stuff like that. It's case by case, but I think you do find that a lot of times anybody who's that accomplished in an art form that's that ignored by society, can have a rough time. I mean, Danny was not interested in fame. In fact, kind of actively rejected it. But at the same time, I think he was kind of dumbfounded that nobody was paying attention to him, because he knew how good he was and nobody was paying attention to him. Part of it was his own fault. But, you know, we mortals, you and I sit around going, I wonder why more people don't listen to our music. But I'm well aware that that must be a lot worse if you really know, like, wow, I'm one of the greatest guitar players that ever lived. You might not say that to somebody, but you damn well know it. And why isn't anybody paying attention? I mean, Holdsworth having to sell gear so he could make a record. How is that possible?
Well, um, Gary Husband mentioned that he was very fond of giving $100 bills as tips,
Oh,
and that
that's how it was possible.
that's how it was possible.
Oh, wow. So he was
Yeah,
not necessarily very good with money.
he was not.
Yeah.
But this topic of guitar players and or musicians that don't get noticed, I'm kind of interested in this sort of middle ground figure of being known and revered, but also being not as widely known as you would think in Pat Martino.
Yeah, he was such a fascinating person
Yeah.
and such a really one of those guys who had that genius thing. That word gets thrown around a lot, and not everybody in my book, by the way, would I put that label on. And but I'm very careful when I say something like, "Oh man, that guy's a genius." We throw that term around, and I think it's overused,
Mhm.
and I don't like that. But Pat Martino, if you listen to what he was doing at age 14, it's just like something was given to this guy. It's not, yeah, he worked really, really hard, but but I like to imagine what it's like to have picked up the guitar and have it been like, wow, it's like I can kind of do this really easily. Like, what's going on here? And then it makes you want to work harder, I'm imagining, because you're already so good and everybody's like, wow, you're incredible, and giving you a lot of love for it. And then you work on it, and then you're really incredible at 15 when everybody else is out just playing baseball or whatever. And you know, did you see Pat before his aneurysm?
I did. And I also had the honor of sitting in his home and taking his oral history for Yale after the aneurysm.
Wow, yeah.
And that was interesting too, because as you know, well,
He's
that
so fascinating.
he had to relearn the guitar.
Yeah.
And then he had interesting memory stories about how things would come back to him, but
Mm,
by being flashed off of one word that
wow.
someone mentioned, and how he really came up on the New Jersey Philly PA scene, playing out here on Route 46. And Joe Pesci was at that time a musician on the circuit of bars. And he met Joe Pesci, re-met Joe Pesci, and Joe Pesci said, Pat, you don't remember me?" And Pat said, "No." And then he goes, I remember you from Goodfellas." And he goes, "No, no, I came up on the scene with you." And at
Hilarious.
that point, he said it flashed back to him. So that's a whole interesting thing too. The brain of that man,
Yeah.
and then of course all the different conceptual levels that he was dealing with in the 60s and Eastern thought. And
Yeah. You know, that record where he's playing with a sitar player in 68. I mean, maybe not the greatest Pat Martino record if you look at his whole body of work, but he was really ahead of his time in that sort of Eastern
mm,
mysticism meets jazz idea. And he was a very young man when that was going on. And you know, although I think towards the end of his life he was kind of making similar records, you look at his early work and it's really all over the place. I mean, Joyous Lake to me is one of, if we may use the word fusion, one of the greatest fusion records of all time.
jazz rock.
Jazz rock. It's just incredible. And I did see that band live and it just blew my mind.
Mm. And what do we know about the American blues tradition and how it unleashed so many different stylists within what we would call blues or roots music? I'm very interested in that idea of the early American blossoming of the guitar with all the different, playing using a steak knife as a slide, or
Yeah.
all the different ways of approaching the right hand. And could you talk a little bit about that kind of genesis of this? Because
I
you're
think
such a
that's a
guitar
great question.
historian.
That is a great question because I think we do have to remember where the guitar came from. So I mentioned Snoozer Quinn, but he was an anomaly. Almost all the guitar players back then were black men,
Mhm.
and they came from the blues. I mean, people like Charlie Patton did way more than just play the blues. You know, this guy was the original Renaissance man. I mean, for his time, he was, you know, we use the term eclectic a lot. Wow, he plays jazz, rock, and country, you know, as if that's surprising these days. He's eclectic. But Sunhouse was like the original eclectic American guitar player, you know, gospel hymns, ragtime, um, uh, down home blues, and stuff that kind of fit in between what we might call folk songs. Um, and country, really. I mean, he was really countrified in his blues playing. So people like that were this model the guitar, what I always like to point out about the guitar is this is the original American instrument. Sure, we had the voice and the drum. The drum, of course, came from Africa, and it was very important in how our music developed. But the guitar is really the repository of where blues and country and a mix of blues and country and folk, and even, of course, the piano was more the ragtime instrument, but the early guitar and banjo was really important in New Orleans. And so much of everything except jazz was guitar based for so long. And, guitar was really secondary in jazz for many, many years. Of course, it's not anymore. But that's why the greatest flowering of the guitar in the 50s and 60s is blues and rock music. It's not jazz. There were some incredible jazz players, and it started to really change with people like Wes Montgomery and and the like, and people before him too, Charlie Christian, obviously. But what really put the guitar on the map was, of course, rock music, and that came from the blues. And so the people that I didn't write about, I could just go on and on and on in terms of the important blues players that sort of had their little regional thing that they did. They occupied a certain position. I mean, there's just so many of them that were so impactful to a relatively small group of people. I mean, when you think about how important that was to Mike Bloomfield and Jerry Garcia and Duane Allman, and I mean, pretty much everything in rock guitar for decades has come from them. Really important. And so, but I would go even further and say that Bill Frisell and John Scofield couldn't possibly have the sound that they have without that. Pat Metheny kind of could. And then that's a whole, we don't need to get into the weeds here, but he didn't really grow up playing rock music at all. He just went straight to jazz, as Julian Lage did, which really is amazing to me, by the way. Like, that you could not be a rock guitarist in that time. That was everything. It was everywhere.
It's unusual. Yes.
Yeah. And that's one of the many things that makes him stand out so incredibly. But I love thinking about that, because that's why the guitar is the everyman instrument. It's the one you take to the campfire. That's Portable. Given us so much American music, and so much of our history is the guitar. It's intertwined with the guitar. Hank Williams, Merle Haggard,
Glenn Campbell,
and B.B. King. And where would we have, God, literally, where would we be without these people? We'd be all sitting around the parlor playing classical guitars still, and singing like sort of British folk tunes or something. I don't know.
Chet Atkins.
Yeah. There's a guy I sort of talked about him in the book, but it's miraculous how much you can do on the guitar. It's really infinite in a certain way. And by the way, I think that guitar and drums is kind of everything. I think that's really what one needs in life for music. Everything else is filler.
We're not prejudiced.
I'm not talking about concert music here. I'm talking about just like dancing and improvising and community meetings. And
I won't argue against
revolution.
Yeah. Revolution. Yeah, exactly. Wow, that's so interesting. And how many bands are formed by guitar drum duo, going from Mahavishnu Orchestra to Van Halen?
Yeah, Van Halen. Yeah, I want to read that book by his brother, by the way.
Yes, me too.
Very good book.
Seems like he's pretty articulate about the whole situation, and I've heard him interviewed recently about the book. So
Yeah.
yeah, obviously there's another example of the guitar technique level jump, you know. So if we look at, you know, the early finger style American guitar players, and then we look at now the neck is in play in a
Yeah.
different way.
And there's all these people doing that now. Like I keep coming across these people doing variations of this tapping thing that are mind blowing.
Yeah.
And now different necks. Like some guy just who came to my Telecaster camp, I should say our Telecaster camp, which I run with Jim Weeder. He invented a pedal steel with lower action that he taps on. He sent me this recording. It's insane. With a wah-wah pedal, he's just wailing.
Becomes like a keyboard.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this level jump of the tapping thing, you know, shout out to Frederick Thorndahl of Metallica. You know, I mean, it's just all facile changing of attack and being able to spread notes out in a way that is quite advantageous when you get away from the pick.
I know. I kind of wish I'd learned to do that, but I never did.
Well, you do plenty of other things, you know. It's like
I was like just about 7 years too old.
It's
Anybody
really
who
interesting.
came up with like with Van Halen when they were 16 learned how to tap. They kind of just a little bit. They sort of had to.
Mm-hmm.
But Nels Cline never learned. He didn't need, like, we're the same age. We didn't. It just wasn't on our radar. And we was like, oh God, it's just one more thing to learn. That's too much.
But one thing I want to talk about with you guys and guitar players, Nels and Joel and all of you guys, is the idea of vibrato and the idea of bending notes. Because you just brought me into the mind of Nels Cline, where at one point he said to me, I don't bend notes. So it's a little bit, well, I think there was a period of time where, you're avoiding certain things, like when Holdsworth was avoiding the whammy bar, and then eventually had it down to like a little nub, and you get tired of certain things. And so he was, I remember, I don't want to speak for him, but my recollection was, well, I'm so besotted with John McLaughlin, I think maybe I shouldn't go down the bending all the notes road.
Could be.
So to me, and to put a finer point on it, folks, style is also what you don't do.
Yes.
What you won't allow into the sound space. So, I'm interested in that idea of, well, I don't do pull-offs, or I don't do tremolos, or I don't do, like, is that crazy?
I don't get any of that. I beg jazz guitarists who come to me for a lesson, or we're talking or whatever at the camp. I say, please start pulling notes, start doing all the stuff that only the guitar can do. Because it's our instrument. That's what makes it our instrument. I mean, to me, the expressive quality of a John Scofield, the way he will just manipulate with his left hand endlessly, with pulls and pull-offs and vibrato and different kinds of vibrato. And in fact, when he was at our camp last year, and I was really watching closely, like way more than I ever thought, this makes up his sound. And I just think that's what makes the guitar exciting. I'm not going to say that seeing Barney Kessel is not really great, because he didn't need to pull notes. He did fine. But that was a different era.
What was that, coming out of piano? What was it then?
Yeah, I think everybody really wanted to be pianistic, but more importantly, the instrument didn't lend itself to that. People were playing with heavy strings, archtop guitars. Pulling notes was not even possible when you're playing 14 gauge or 13 gauge strings. pull offs and hammer-ons a little bit. But, you know, rock musicians in the invention of lower action and, you know, playing louder and stuff, and the movement of Chicago blues into rock and jazz guitar just made this much more common. And to me, you know, even Eric Clapton, who's not my favorite guitar player, I think said, and boy, I hope I'm not misquoting him here, that, you know, vibrato is everything in the blues. That's really how you distinguish yourself. And if you listen to the different blues players, they all have a very different vibrato.
Yeah.
And it does distinguish them. BB's vibrato is instantly identifiable, as is Albert Collins. And, you know, I can say that I'm not really, you know, I'm not sure I have a style as a guitar player. Like I'm kind of a chameleon, but if there's one thing that I do that a lot of people don't do, if I'm playing a jazz standard, I'll be doing country licks and pulling notes, because why wouldn't you? It's very expressive.
It is expressive. Yeah.
Piano players have to be jealous of us. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We're jealous of piano players because they can play 10 notes at the same time. But
yeah,
they should be jealous of us because we can bend pitches. I mean, think about it. Bending pitches has been going on for thousands of years. There's a lot of music in between those 12 tones.
I know that you're a fan of Indian music, and you know we certainly learn a lot from that. So tell me about what's happening nowadays, Joel. I know you have a really big gig coming up. As this airs, you'll be playing this evening, and tell me a little bit about what's happening.
Well, I run this thing called the Alternative Guitar Summit, which has been in existence for 15 years. And it's basically an advocacy platform for creative guitar playing. And, you know, somehow along the line, it's hard to know exactly how and why. It's a long story, but I became, you know, one of the great boosters of guitar players and guitar playing and modern. Well, I love all guitar playing, so I wouldn't even say it always has to be, you know, like way out there or avant-garde at all. I love straight ahead guitar playing and acoustic music and everything. But, you know, I've kind of specialized in unusual, forward-thinking, visionary kind of players, of which our friend Nels is one. You know, the Ben Monders of this world. And anyway, so every now and then we do showcases, and I try to put some people on stage who are not, you know, to me, well enough known, maybe doing something interesting with different pairings of people playing together, maybe. Just a way of programming music that other people might not think of, that delivers a one-of-a-kind of experience. So tonight, I guess we're doing that with Pedro Martins, I should say, who's a kind of an astounding player from Brazil who now lives in California. Gilad Hexelman, who's a younger, brilliant player. They're all brilliant. Anthony Pirog, who's at this point kind of an old friend of mine, who truly comes from our beloved jazz rock perspective and plays in that group, the Methetics. And a younger player, Emmanuel Michael, who's kind of making some waves with his own approach to playing, I would say. And Dida Peled, who's an Israeli-born guitarist, has got a beautiful voice and, you know, kind of writes tunes that of her own, in her own way. I don't know how else to put it. So we're all going to get together with Rudy Royston, Jerome Harris, and play. And largely for me, this is, you know, I've just done so many of these, and a lot of it happens now at the guitar camps I run, the Alternative Guitar Summit Camp, which, if I can just briefly put on my salesman cap, is about to announce its 2025 lineup with this astounding array of guitar players you can spend 4 days with in the Catskills, through Music Masters Collective. We run this camp that you can come and stay for 4 days and hang out with whoever it is, Nels or John Schofield or Kurt Rosenwinkel or Gilad or Rodney Jones, Mark Ribot. That all of them have been there, and now also a Telecaster camp that I run with the guy who's played with the band for so many years after Robbie Roberts and Jim Weeder. And that's a real trip. We did it for the first year, and that was totally different. And then the Alternative Guitar Summit, and we had Red Volkert and Guthrie Trapp and Albert Lee came, and it was amazing. Wow. So that is kind of where I put a lot of my time now, in terms of getting those camps going, and they're just a wonderful, life-changing opportunity for fans around the world of the guitar.
Joel, I'm very curious about your non-guitar music, because I know that, like me, you're very interested in chamber music and composing for other instruments, other styles. I know that you've said you're not really a genre person. So could you talk a little bit about your approach?
Well, the irony about all this guitar advocacy is that in my own music, the guitar is not forefront at all. And I hear music as a composer, not through the guitar, but through the various instrumental combinations that I'm writing for. And as I was, kind of coming up, trying to figure out who I was, it was really important to me when I decided to kind of throw my lot in with jazz, which it really felt like that, because I felt pulled in so many different directions. But then I felt like, broadly speaking, jazz was the only container big enough to hold what I wanted to do, that writing for different combinations of instruments was really important to me. And because I was never going to be the guy to do a guitar trio. I wasn't, frankly, I didn't ever feel like I was a good enough guitar player or cared enough about the guitar to do that. I mean, maybe I'm being too hard on myself, but when my second record had bassoon and English horn, trombone and saxophone in the front line, and drums and percussion, that was really important to me. That to me made a statement as a composer and as an arranger that was different than just writing guitar music. Mm-hmm. And then I arranged country music for the guitar, for a guitar-based band, but still I wasn't necessarily forefront in the arrangements. And then I arranged Paul Motion's music for string quartet and two guitars. And the strings were very much as important, or more so, as the guitar in that group. And so I've always, when I write classical music, it's rarely for the guitar, although ironically, I finally just wrote some classical guitar music that's coming out in April. But I think it's as interesting to me, and more interesting, to write for other instruments. And I guess on my wish list, before I pass on to the larger realm, is I would love to write more for orchestra or string quartet or whatever it is, because I feel like I can exercise my abilities in a way far more doing that than I can writing for the guitar, and especially for myself, with whatever my limitations are as a player.
Yes, it is, I think, super important to be able to think about music outside of what your hands can do.
Yes, I know you do that.
Well, it was taught to me very early. My first composition teacher, Jeff Kresge, said to me, you're going to need to write away from the piano. Right. So, I mean, not that I was a pianist, but like, you need to write away from the instrument as much as you can, and work with ear and work with maybe singing. That was a thing that I did too, was singing parts into recording
Mhm.
devices just to be able to not have to rely on my chops or
Well,
chop.
I mean, I think it's different now, but you were sort of early on, sort of the rare drummer who was writing, really composing a lot of music. There were a few people doing it, Bob Moses um, and folks, but I always appreciated that about you, that you were thinking way bigger than the drum set.
Well, that was an early goal, you know. I didn't want to be just a drummer. And
Mhm.
also I grew up with guys like around like Billy Cobham and Max Roach and Tony Williams, who were serious composers, and their sound was extended beyond the kit to their bands.
Yeah.
So that became, you know, that obviously that was a goal, an ideal. And you know, drummers get sick of being thought of as lesser musicians, and so much more of a kick in the pants to prove otherwise.
Hmm.
You know, so yes, by high school I was writing chamber music for
Yeah.
the local folk. And yeah, shouldn't we all aim high? I mean, shouldn't we all go for? I mean, not everyone is a big picture person or artist, and they don't need to be, but just certainly the guys that you know, talking about Max Roach
Yeah.
and what a multifaceted, open, you know, source of material this man was, and
Yeah.
I was lucky because I had you know, face to face time with Max for long
Wow.
periods. And
So cool.
so, yeah, that Max is always going to be one of my heroes for that idea that no, you're a band leader, you're a musician, you're a composer, you can direct from behind the kit. I mean, you know, it wasn't a normal thing
Mm.
previous to those guys, was it really?
Not so much. It's fun you mentioned Billy Cobham because when he toured maybe 5 years ago, and a friend of mine was playing bassoon in the band, Paul Hansen. It was so great to hear his writing. There
Hmm.
was really complex stuff that I wasn't aware of at all, and it was such a great sound.
I think to a certain degree, it really helps if you do take some composition lessons.
Yes.
Uh, and obviously, you know, there are guys who are pre-conventional that are writing anyway. But you know, Paul Motion was a decent piano player. He wrote at the piano, you know, and he was right. I mean, he was a big inspiration for me because he was contemporaneous very much for me finding an Armenian drummer band leader. And you know, I'm sure we
Right.
could do a whole thing about Paul Motion right now. We obviously both are great admirers of his
Yeah.
oeuvre, but I have to say, you know, that he was also in the phone book, and I could call him up and ask him questions, and he would be super cool, and oh, he was just the epitome of cool. Come on,
Yes, he
Paul
was.
Motion, and
Yeah.
he'd go, hey, man, what are you writing
Yeah.
a
Right.
book? They're asking me so many questions. What are you writing a book?
Yeah.
Uh, maybe someday, Paul. Love to Paul Motion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what's your favorite Paul Motion stuff?
Well, the trio with Bill Frisell and Joe Lovano is my favorite stuff. But all of it, his whole era, there's just so much great stuff. But I don't know. I saw that trio probably 40 times. I was a super fan
Yeah,
of that trio.
I was there when they first played Bill and Joel, Bill and
Lovano.
Levon Joe uh, were in the bigger group, the Psalm of Moses group. So it's Ed Schuler,
Yes.
Billy Drews, Bill.
Hmm.
You know, remember that group?
Yes, I
That,
do. I saw them once.
yeah, that was so. You know, the New York thing, the fact that, Paul was always around and he was always playing in New York and he was always doing things. And I was really besotted with the two trio records, Le Voyage and Dance, the two
Yeah.
ECM.
Yeah. Well, you know that Nels auditioned for that group.
No.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, he ended up choosing Bill Frisell, obviously, and Michael Gregory Jackson too.
Now there's somebody I haven't heard about for a
Yeah.
while. Yeah,
I
Michael
mean, when I
Gray.
say audition, that's a loose term, but definitely, um, I think Nels he considered him for the bebop band. Um, he loved guitar players. How great is that?
It is great.
Yeah, and I love his writing. It's amazing.
Hey, remember Sam Brown on those early?
Yeah, he was you know sort of a little known, but I like that playing he did on those. Or I don't know, was it one or two records? But also the record with Keith Jarrett is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we're already talking about Paul Motion and the clock is ticking. People are like looking at their watches going, I thought this was about guitar.
Well, when you're talking about Paul Motion, you do have to address guitar and his
Yes.
love of it.
He was so, oh my God, he hired so many great guitar players.
Yeah. No, but he also knew the orchestral element of the guitar, so he
Yeah.
could utilize it as a
Yeah.
composer.
And apparently played it
Yeah,
himself. I would have loved to hear him play the guitar. It would have been fun.
I know. Well, Joel, this has been so cool. Where is the show tonight?
Oh, that's at New Blue,
New Blue in New York
Manhattan
City.
at 7 p.m. And you know something, by the way, which we didn't even get a chance to talk about it, and I'll just briefly mention because you are um, the interviewer here. Um, I'm one of the only people to make what I would consider a jazz recording with a sarod player, and so this whole Indian rhythms and you know harmonic thing mixing with jazz is happening more and more. But I know you have been interested in that for such a long time, and one of my proudest achievements, boy, if you haven't heard this record, I've got to send it to you immediately, because you'll relate to it so much, is music for a percussion quartet, sarod, a jazz group with Dan Weiss, Ben Wendell, and Hans Klobashnig, and Selva Ganesh
Oh, wow.
on a couple of tracks. That to me is an example, of one of my proudest moments where nobody could have thought of that, I guess, except me, because it's such an unusual. I was like, I want to bring together classical music, Indian music, and jazz. How do I do that? And this was my attempt to do that. And boy, was it ever an experiment. And God, that there's only one or two people in each chair that could have possibly done it in the whole world. And my sarod playing for Anandapam Shobhakar is broke new ground on the sarod, and never has received absolutely no credit or love for it whatsoever. But he did. And then the fact that I got to play with Selva Ganesh absolutely blew my mind.
Oh,
That
boy.
guy is like just a force of nature. And I'll just tell one other story about him.
Please.
This
Yeah.
is this is I think we have to understand something about these younger virtuosic traditional players. He's not really traditional, and that's the whole point. These guys want to do more than play their own music. Their whole lives they've been trained in this maximal way to do this virtuosic music, pretty much in his case better than anyone on earth, or at least one of the two or three. I don't know, I'm no expert.
Well, let's throw in then you've got Srinivas, who made non-traditional Indian
Right.
influenced recordings that are incredible. With
Yeah.
McLaughlin on electric and just, and don't forget who we recently lost, the great master Zakir Hussain.
A perfect example of this. So you when I met Selva Ganesh and we're hanging out, I was saying, man, I'd love to have you play with me sometime doing something else. But he said, oh, I'd love to play some jazz with you. I said, well, how about some funk? And he said, oh, I'd love to do that.
Yep.
So he played on this 50-year anniversary concert I did of the music of Woodstock and sat in with us on some Sly Stone stuff. I mean, that was cool.
Yeah, it's cool.
This is what we need in the world. I always say that music is, and improvising and all this is a model for world peace. And if people could only act like we do on stage, not necessarily off stage, because we can be crazy too, but on stage, boy, the world would just be one big happy party.
I have said that, and I do believe that. And the importance of the democratic approach to a jazz band is no small thing.
Yes, you know that very well.
I want to hear from everybody in the band.
Yeah, exactly. And the more they differ in where they're coming from, the potential for something interesting happening is there. Doesn't always work, but
we try.
It's these combinations of different things that keep life interesting.
And I love that you say, in my brain and my brain alone, I found a way to think of jazz, classical, and Indian music becoming the concept of fusion. I don't think of fusion as a style of music. Exactly. I think of it as a concept, because obviously there's fusion taking place in cooking and cuisine right now. There's fusion taking place in dance styles. There's fusion. It's a concept. And it's guys like us that came up with everything on the table.
Yes.
And didn't judge. And we're lucky enough to come up when we came up with the wealth of approaches that we came up and were exposed to that can set us free.
Yes. The key to this word fusion, which was so pilloried when we were growing up, is that all music is fusion music.
Stravinsky's fusion.
Bluegrass.
Totally.
This is the African-American influence on Bill Monroe is a known entity. So
Newgrass.
All musics come together from this friction of people meeting each other from different neighborhoods and then different countries and maybe someday different galaxies. So, that's still going on and always will go on.
Well, purity is, in my opinion, not something that really exists.
Exactly.
So there's always crossbreeding going on. There's always cross-pollination. And if you think that you are the pure version of something, I might have a few questions for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm purely this, I'm purely that. Well,
Right.
Maybe you didn't think about it too much, because I don't know about this purity concept. I think it's dangerous if you
get your
my
DNA
opinion.
checked.
Yeah,
you think
exactly.
You're so pure. Actually, you're a mixture.
Pretty much. I know I am.
Yeah.
Well, Joel, this is so great. I think we're going to leave it here for now. Looking forward to your guitar show. Looking forward to playing with you again. And fans and folks and listeners, thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate all the love and the comments. And 2025, we've got a lot planned for interesting conversations. Please like, subscribe, look us up on Patreon, and hit us with a few bucks, because we're trying to keep this thing at this level now, 4.5 years in, and have interesting musicians like Joel Harrison here, who's an author and a conceptualist. I'm going to say that right out front, or toward the back, but it's true. And patrons, you'll get a bonus round that I'm going to do with Joel with some rapid fire question and answer. So thank you for listening and watching the ProgCast, folks. Thank you, Joel Harrison.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Gregg.
Thanks, Joel. See you again.